They fired me at 10:42 a.m. on a Tuesday, right after I finished warning them, again, that the grid load models were showing instability. Not hypothetical instability. Not theoretical someday soon instability. Imminent failure. A perfect storm of outdated transformers, deferred maintenance, and a new AI-driven optimization system that was blindly shaving margins for efficiency gains. Their response wasn't surprise. It wasn't concern. It was annoyance. The CTO didn't even look at my report. She just slid a termination letter across the table and said, "We need people who understand modern systems, not dinosaurs who see danger everywhere." Old tech, she called me. A relic. A liability. I walked out holding the same binder I'd carried for years, full of predictive models, handwritten notes, and handwritten warnings no algorithm could replicate, because they came from experience, not code. But experience didn't trend on LinkedIn. Algorithms did. And the company had become addicted to shiny dashboards and real-time graphs, forgetting that data without interpretation was just noise dressed in confidence. My badge deactivated before I reached the lobby. Typical. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that the very AI system they worshipped was working off a corrupted seasonal baseline. A tiny anomaly. One line of inherited bad data from a vendor integration 3 months earlier. I caught it. They ignored it. And so I went home, sat by my old drafting desk, and watched the grid data like a retired firefighter watching a building smolder, too far to intervene, close enough to smell the smoke through memory alone. 2 days later, at precisely 6:17 p.m., the load numbers spiked exactly the way I had predicted. A cold snap rolled in earlier than forecasted, pushing every heating system into overdrive. Demand shot past tolerance. Their AI responded by pushing even harder, redistributing load across nodes that couldn't sustain the burn, creating oscillations that should never have happened. At 6:23, the first substation overloaded. At 6:24, 2 more tripped. At 6:27, the oscillation wave reached the metro loop. And then, like the entire grid taking a single shuddering breath, the city went dark. All 42 districts. Every hospital that hadn't switched to backup. Every server room that trusted smart failover. Every street light, every subway line, every home. Blackout. Complete, total, preventable blackout. I expected satisfaction. Vindication. Something hot and triumphant. Instead, I felt a cold, heavy stillness, not the thrill of revenge, but the weight of being right when being right meant people suffered. Within 30 minutes, my phone lit up. Unrecognized numbers. Blocked callers. Then the inevitable one, the CTO. I let it ring. 15 seconds later, the CEO called. I let that ring too. Then my former team. The compliance director. The city energy regulator. Finally, a text, "We need you. Please." Only then did I answer the phone. The voice on the other end wasn't arrogant anymore. Not dismissive. Not superior. It was shaking. "We didn't know," she whispered. "The AI didn't alert us. The vendor said, the vendor lied," I cut in. "And your system trusted them because you told it to." There was a long silence. Not the kind that asks for forgiveness, the kind that admits guilt. "Can you fix it?" she asked. "I warned you months ago," I said. "I gave you precise instructions. You discarded them." She swallowed audibly. "We're asking for your help now." "I'm sure you are." Across the city, families were lighting candles. Metro lines were halted. Emergency rooms were swamped. But none of it had to happen. None of it, if someone had listened. "I'll need full authority," I said flatly. No interference. No committees. No override from AI systems. And no one, touches the load balancers unless I say so. Yes, she said immediately. Too immediately. They were desperate. And when it's over, I added, you will publicly acknowledge why this happened. A pause. Then, quietly, agreed. I returned to the control center under escort, walking past rooms full of frantic executives who suddenly looked very, very small. The big wall of dashboards flickered uselessly, beautiful graphics displaying catastrophic reality. I ignored them all. I went straight to the manual controls. Not the AI console. Not the optimization board. The physical system, the one no one under 30 even remembered how to use. Within 3 hours, the grid stabilized. 8 hours later, the city blinked back to life. The next morning, the CEO kept her promise. A full public statement. My predictions. Their neglect. Their mistake. Once the dust settled, the board reached out with an offer, CTO, full authority, blank check. I declined. Revenge wasn't staying. Revenge wasn't winning. Revenge was letting them live with the knowledge that everything collapsed because they replaced wisdom with aesthetics, experience with arrogance, a human engineer with a modern solution. Instead, I accepted a government role advising multiple cities on grid resilience. People who listened. People who understood that old tech wasn't outdated, it was proven. And every time a young engineer asks why I never returned to my old company, I answer the same way. Because once you've seen a system collapse from ignorance, you don't rebuild it for them. You build something better for everyone else. They tried to spin it afterward, of course. Press releases with soft language like unexpected grid stressors and unforeseen system interactions. But the public wasn't buying it, not after the photos circulated. A picture of me standing in the manual control room, sleeves rolled up, binder open, cables rerouted by hand like it was 1998 and the world was saved by engineers, not influencers. Someone on the staff snapped it during the chaos and posted it with the caption, "The man they called obsolete just turned the lights back on." It went viral in minutes. My old company's stock fell in hours. And then came the hearings. Regulators, politicians, oversight committees, they all wanted answers. Everything from maintenance logs to AI decision trees was scrutinized, and the deeper they dug, the more damning the picture became. Deferred upgrades. Ignored risk assessments. A culture of chasing buzzwords over fundamentals. And, in the center of it all, one glowing line in a report timestamped 3 months earlier, reviewed by, my name, high risk, immediate action required. They had dismissed it. Signed off anyway. When the hearings went public, the CTO was the first to resign. The CEO followed a week later. Even the vendor who sold them the faulty model faced an investigation that made them vanish from the market like a bad rumor swallowed by silence. Meanwhile, I became the accidental face of a renaissance, a return to valuing engineering principles over AI infatuation. Universities asked me to guest lecture. Cities requested consultations. Startups wanted audits. Everywhere I went, the same message echoed: we need people who remember how the foundations work. The irony wasn't lost on me. Months later, I walked past my old building. They'd gutted the lobby, new furniture, new art, new slogans about innovation and transparency. But you can't remodel a reputation. Not when the world remembers the blackout. I paused outside for a moment. The receptionist didn't recognize me. New staff. New faces. People who didn't know the old story. People who didn't know the collapse came from a choice, not a surprise. I thought about going in. Just to see. just to witness the aftermath of the arrogance that had pushed me out. But I didn't. I didn't need to. Because every day, in every interview or conference or consultation, someone repeats the line that has followed me since the blackout: "You were right." Those words aren't revenge by themselves. They're something better. They're a reminder, etched into industry memory, that knowledge outlasts trend, and experience outmaneuvers ego. And sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply living long enough for everyone else to see what you saw from the start. I walked away from the building with the quiet satisfaction of a man who didn't just win, he outlasted. In the weeks that followed, the narrative shifted entirely. No longer was I the old tech guy in a modern world. I had become the benchmark by which every other engineer was suddenly judged. Companies that once worshipped automation began scrambling to hire people who actually understood the systems AI only pretended to manage. Recruiters filled my inbox with desperate, borderline embarrassing offers: flexible salary. Name your hours. Remote, hybrid, on-site, or none at all. We'll rebuild the department around you. They weren't looking for talent, they were looking for insurance. The blackout had made one truth unavoidable: if you don't understand the machine, you can't control the machine. And most of them were realizing they had built empires on code they didn't even know how to read. But the one request that caught my attention wasn't about money at all. It came from a mid-sized energy startup, nothing flashy, nothing overfunded, no gimmicks. Their pitch was simple: we want to build systems that don't fail when the shiny parts break. I visited their office out of curiosity. No HR buzzwords. No neon innovation hub signage. Just a small team of engineers who valued redundancy, manual overrides, and common sense. They asked for my help designing a hybrid grid management system, human-led, AI-assisted, failure-resistant. Not sexy. Not headline-worthy. But real. I said yes. And when I walked into my new workspace on the first day, someone had humorously taped a small plaque above the central console: Legacy Mode, Enabled. I laughed harder than I had in years. It didn't feel like mockery. It felt like recognition, like someone finally understood that legacy isn't about age, it's about endurance, stability, and the unshakable confidence that comes from doing the work long before the world cared. Meanwhile, my old company continued to unravel. Class action lawsuits. Federal oversight. A revolving door of interim executives trying, failing, to steady a ship already taking on water. Their new AI engineer gave an interview admitting he'd joined only because he was fascinated by how badly things had been mismanaged. Ouch! But I wasn't celebrating their collapse anymore. Revenge had burned hot at first, sharp and satisfying, but now I understood something deeper. They had fired me because they couldn't see my value. Their downfall wasn't my victory. My survival was. The real triumph was this: seeing a new generation of engineers, interns, technicians, and operators come through my project doors eager to learn, eager to question, eager to build. I taught them everything I knew, not because I wanted to spite the past, but because I wanted to protect the future. One evening, after wrapping up a long mentoring session, I looked around the lab at the humming servers and the neatly labeled breakers in the emergency override system we had all designed together. This was my revenge. Not destruction. Not humiliation. But creation. A quiet legacy stronger than any blackout. And as I locked up the lab and stepped outside into the warm dusk, I finally felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Peace didn't mean the story was over. In fact, the final chapter arrived quietly, like most truths do, wrapped not in drama, but in consequence. 6 months into my new role, the startup's hybrid grid system caught the attention of a national regulatory committee. Not because of our funding, or our flashy marketing, we had none, but because our pilot district had gone through a severe storm without losing power for even a second. While the major providers scrambled. While the big players issued apologies. While entire neighborhoods sat in darkness. Our district stayed lit. People noticed. The committee requested a full demonstration. Engineers from across the country filled our control room to see how a small team of old tech revivalists had outperformed billion-dollar systems. I walked them through it, the layered redundancy, the human-AI balance, the predictive models checked manually rather than blindly trusted. But the moment that really shifted the room was when one senior regulator asked, "Why didn't your system cascade like the others?" I tapped the manual override board. A simple, metal panel with labeled switches and printed instructions. "Because this works even when nothing else does," I said. "And because everyone here knows how to use it." Silence. Then nods around the room. By the end of the month, the committee announced a historic initiative. Every grid in the region would adopt a version of our system. Mandatory. Standardized. Nationwide within 5 years. And just like that, the work I'd once been mocked for, the very ideas that got me fired, became policy. My old company? They weren't even considered in the rollout. Too unstable. Too many violations. Too many scars from the blackout they caused. One afternoon, I received a message from an unfamiliar number. "You were right. About everything. I'm sorry." It was my former CEO. I stared at the text for a long time. Once, I might have wanted this moment, might have chased it, replayed it, savored it. But now? It felt small compared to what we were building. I didn't respond. Instead, I went back to the lab, where a new batch of interns were arguing over sensor redundancy. They paused when I entered, waiting for judgment. I shook my head. "Don't argue," I said. "Test both." They grinned, scrambling back to the workbench. This, teaching people who cared, building systems that mattered, creating resilience that would outlive all of us, was the real ending. Or maybe the real beginning. Before heading home that night, I stepped outside and looked at the city skyline. Lights shimmered across every building. No flickers. No outages. No fear of collapse. A grid that wasn't fragile anymore. A system strengthened not by ego, but by understanding. And as the breeze carried the hum of powered streets, I realized I wasn't obsolete. I was the blueprint. The blueprint didn't stay local for long. Within a year, invitations started arriving from places I'd only ever seen on maps, countries wrestling with aging infrastructure, cities trying to transition to renewables, regions desperate to prevent the very disaster my old company had caused. They weren't looking for consultants. They weren't looking for innovation gurus. They wanted something much rarer, a system that wouldn't fail when humans needed it most. I found myself sitting at tables with ministers, engineers, military planners, and economists. Every discussion began the same way: how did your system survive when there's collapsed? And every time, I answered the same: because we treat the grid like a living organism, not a spreadsheet. Sometimes they laughed. Until I showed them the data. By the end of those meetings, the laughter always turned into signatures. But the moment that surprised me most came from a place I never expected, a tech conference, of all things. I'd been invited to give a keynote, mostly because someone on the planning board wanted a practical engineer to balance the buzzwords. The auditorium was packed, hundreds of executives, software leads, AI researchers, all expecting a flashy slide deck or some ironic self-aware speech about the good old days. Instead, I brought the manual override panel. Just placed it on the podium. A metal board. Switches. Labels. Instructions printed in plain English. I told the blackout story, not with drama, but with facts. What the models missed. What the AI couldn't interpret. What the management ignored. Then I lifted the panel. This saved 2 million people from sitting in darkness. Not because it's smart, but because it's understandable. The room fell silent. After the talk, a young engineer approached me, maybe 23, bright eyes, nervous voice. She said, "Everyone here thinks tech is supposed to replace people. But you treat tech like it should help people. Why?" I smiled. Because someday, when everything goes wrong, it won't be a machine that fixes it. It'll be you. She didn't respond at first. She just stood there, thinking, really thinking, not about trends or headlines, but about responsibility. When she finally walked away, I felt something shift. Not in the industry. Not in the world. In her. That's when I understood the truth. My revenge wasn't the blackout. It wasn't their collapse. It wasn't titles, awards, or headlines. My revenge was that the next generation wasn't going to repeat the same arrogant mistakes. They were listening. They were learning. They were questioning everything the old company refused to question. And as I stood backstage after the talk, watching engineers gather around the manual panel instead of the AI booths, I realized the legacy they once tried to fire out of me wasn't gone. It was spreading. Quietly. Steadily. Irreversibly. In the hum of servers built with fail-safes. In the hands of students trained to think before they automate. In the grids of cities that would never again fear the night. I didn't just outlast them. I outlived their entire way of thinking. The final closure came on a quiet morning, in a way I never expected, not with a headline, not with another crisis, not with an apology letter slid under my door, but with a simple invitation. It arrived in a plain envelope. No seals. No corporate insignia. Just my name written in neat handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "We request your presence at the national unveiling of the Unified Resilience Standard." My breath caught. The URS, every engineer's dream, every policymaker's debate, every city planner's prayer, was the new global framework for grid safety, redundancy, ethical automation, and human AI collaboration. A standard that would guide how countries built their infrastructure for the next century. A standard based, in part, on my work. There was also a second line: "You will be recognized as a foundational contributor." Not the sole architect. Not the hero. Not the savior of a blackout. A foundational contributor. A brick in the structure. A line in the blueprint. Exactly where I belonged. When I arrived at the venue, I expected formality, stiffness, the usual political choreography. Instead, I found engineers young and old, students with notebooks, industry leaders carrying toolkits instead of tablets. And scattered throughout the crowd, on badges, on brochures, on posters, I saw 3 words repeated: human-first engineering. My philosophy. My stubborn, outdated, ridiculed philosophy. The one that got me fired. On stage, the minister gave her opening remarks, then waved me forward. I wasn't prepared for the applause that followed, not polite clapping, but the warm, sustained recognition of people who understood what it meant to be ignored, underestimated, dismissed as obsolete. When the crowd finally quieted, I didn't talk about the blackout. I didn't talk about the failure of my old company. I didn't talk about AI or algorithms or arrogance. I said one thing: machines fail. Humans fail. But systems that combine the strengths of both, those endure. Build for endurance, and you'll never fear collapse. That was it. No grand speech. No victory lap. Afterward, a small group of interns approached me. They carried notebooks filled with sketches of resilient grids, annotated with questions I recognized from my own early career. One of them asked, "Sir, what do we do if leadership ignores us? If they think we're obsolete?" I smiled. "You outlive them," I said. "And you build something better in the meantime." Their laughter was soft but hopeful, the kind that belongs to people who haven't yet been crushed by bureaucracy, but now had armor. Late that afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the city, the minister handed me a commemorative plaque. Not flashy. Not gilded. Just brushed steel, engraved with the words, "For proving that experience is not old, only unvalued." That line settled something inside me I hadn't realized was still restless. Walking out of the venue, past the crowd, past the reporters, past the government vehicles, I felt the weight of my past finally lift, not erased, not rewritten, but integrated into a larger story. A story no longer about revenge. A story about resilience. A story about creation over destruction. And as the city lights flickered on, stable, bright, unwavering, I understood the real ending. They fired me for being old tech. But the world adopted my principles to build its future. In the end, their dismissal didn't define me. My work did. And it always will.